3 months ago, I collapsed at my family's dinner table after my mother served me what she called a special meal just for you, since you're so worthless anyway. When I woke up in the emergency room, the toxicology report revealed something that shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. My parents had been systematically poisoning me with antifreeze for over 6 months, slowly trying to kill me while telling me I was imagining my symptoms. But that night in the hospital, as I stared at the medical evidence that proved my parents had been attempting murder, I made a decision that would transform me from their victim into the strongest version of myself I had ever imagined possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rebecca Chen, and I am 23 years old. Until 3 months ago, I believed I was living a relatively normal life as the youngest daughter in what appeared to be a typical middle-class family in Portland, Oregon. I had graduated from Portland State University 8 months earlier with a degree in graphic design and had recently started working as a junior designer at a small marketing agency downtown. Looking back now, I can see how naive I was about the dynamics in my household and how systematically my parents had conditioned me to accept treatment that no person should ever endure. But at the time, I thought the constant criticism, the daily reminders of my supposed inadequacies, and the increasingly frequent episodes of illness were simply unfortunate aspects of family life that I needed to endure until I could afford to move out on my own. My parents, David and Linda Chen, had emigrated from Taiwan when I was 5 years old. They had built what appeared to be a successful life in America through hard work and careful financial planning. My father worked as an accountant for a mid-sized construction company, while my mother managed the administrative operations for a chain of dental offices. They owned a modest 3-bedroom house in southeast Portland, drove reliable cars, and maintained the outward appearance of a stable, hard-working immigrant family pursuing the American dream. However, beneath this facade of respectability existed a household dynamic that was profoundly dysfunctional and, as I would eventually discover, genuinely dangerous. My parents had developed an intricate system of emotional and psychological abuse that centered around their belief that I was fundamentally flawed, inherently worthless, and destined to bring shame upon our family. The psychological abuse had been constant throughout my childhood and adolescence, but it intensified dramatically after my college graduation. My parents viewed my degree in graphic design as evidence of my lack of seriousness about building a meaningful career. They frequently compared me unfavorably to my older sister Michelle, who had graduated from medical school 2 years earlier and was completing her residency in internal medicine at Oregon Health and Science University. Michelle represented everything my parents believed a successful child should be: academically accomplished, professionally ambitious, financially responsible, and completely devoted to bringing honor to our family name. In contrast, they viewed my interest in creative work as frivolous and my personality as fundamentally incompatible with the values they considered essential for success. The daily routine in our household revolved around reinforcing these messages through a combination of verbal criticism, emotional manipulation, and systematic undermining of my confidence and self-worth. Every morning at breakfast, my parents would review my schedule for the day and provide detailed commentary about my professional inadequacies, my poor judgment about career decisions, and my failure to demonstrate appropriate gratitude for their support. "Rebecca," my mother would say while preparing my breakfast, "your sister Michelle called last night to tell us about the research project she is leading at the hospital. She is making a real contribution to society, helping people, building something meaningful with her life." My father would nod in agreement and add, "Meanwhile, you spend your days making pretty pictures for advertisements. How do you think that makes us feel when our colleagues ask about our daughters? Michelle makes us proud. You make us embarrassed." These conversations occurred every single morning, with variations that addressed different aspects of my supposed failures and shortcomings. My parents had an extraordinary ability to identify whatever achievements or positive developments occurred in my life and reframe them as evidence of my fundamental inadequacies. When I received a promotion at the marketing agency after 4 months of employment, my parents' response was to criticize the small salary increase as proof that I was working in an industry that did not value talent or hard work. When I completed a successful project that resulted in positive feedback from an important client, they dismissed the accomplishment as meaningless, because graphic design was not a profession that contributed to society in meaningful ways. The emotional abuse was relentless and systematic, but I had learned to accept it as the price of living at home while I saved money to eventually move into my own apartment. My salary at the marketing agency was sufficient to cover basic living expenses, but Portland's rental market made it difficult to find affordable housing that would allow me to maintain financial stability while building savings for future independence. My parents encouraged me to continue living at home, frequently reminding me that my financial situation would be precarious without their support. They charged me $400 per month for rent, which they characterized as a generous arrangement that allowed me to save money while contributing to household expenses. "Rebecca," my father would explain, "we are helping you by letting you stay here at such a low cost. Most parents would charge much more, or they would insist that their adult children find their own places immediately after graduation. We are being generous because we want to help you succeed, even though you make poor decisions." At the time, I believed their characterization of this arrangement was accurate. $400 per month was indeed less expensive than renting an apartment independently, and I was grateful for the opportunity to save money while establishing my career. I accepted their criticism and their rules because I thought they reflected reasonable parental concern about my future success and financial stability. However, what I did not understand was that my parents' treatment of me was designed to maintain control over my life and to prevent me from developing the confidence and independence necessary to build a successful adult life separate from their influence. Every aspect of their behavior was calculated to reinforce my dependence on their approval and support, while systematically undermining my belief in my own capabilities and judgment. The most insidious aspect of their control was how they had conditioned me to question my own perceptions and experiences. When I felt hurt by their constant criticism, they would explain that my emotional reactions demonstrated my immaturity and inability to accept constructive feedback. When I suggested that their treatment of me seemed unusually harsh, they would compare their approach to other families and argue that I was fortunate to have parents who cared enough to provide honest guidance about my shortcomings. "Rebecca," my mother would say when I expressed frustration about their criticism, "other parents let their children make mistakes and learn from failure. We care about you too much to let you ruin your life through poor decisions. If our honesty hurts your feelings, that shows you need to develop stronger character and better judgment." This pattern of emotional manipulation was so consistent and pervasive that I had learned to suppress my own instincts and emotional responses in favor of accepting their interpretations of situations and relationships. I believed that my parents' perspective on my life and choices was more reliable than my own judgment, and I had developed the habit of seeking their approval and guidance for even minor decisions. The psychological foundation that my parents had established through years of systematic emotional abuse created the perfect conditions for the physical abuse that began approximately 8 months after my college graduation. However, the transition from emotional manipulation to physical harm was so gradual and subtle that I did not recognize it as deliberate until the night I nearly died from antifreeze poisoning. The physical symptoms began as occasional episodes of nausea and fatigue that I attributed to stress from starting my new job and adjusting to adult responsibilities. I would experience periods of feeling dizzy, nauseous, and unusually tired, particularly after family meals. Initially, these episodes occurred once or twice per week and lasted only a few hours. My parents were extremely attentive and concerned about these symptoms, frequently suggesting remedies and encouraging me to rest when I felt unwell. My mother would prepare special meals that she claimed would help me feel better, often bringing me soup or tea when I was experiencing nausea or fatigue. "Rebecca," she would say while preparing these special meals, "you need to take better care of yourself. You are working too hard and not eating properly. Let me make something that will help you feel stronger." My father would express similar concern, often suggesting that my symptoms reflected the stress of working in a demanding job without adequate preparation or experience. He would encourage me to consider whether my career choices were appropriate for someone with my constitution and stress tolerance. "Perhaps," he would suggest, "you should consider whether this job is too challenging for you. Some people are not suited for high-pressure work environments. There is no shame in admitting that you need to find something less demanding." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Their concern and attentiveness during my episodes of illness felt like the most positive attention I had received from them in years. For the first time since graduation, they seemed worried about my well-being rather than focused exclusively on my professional and personal shortcomings. However, as months passed, the frequency and severity of my symptoms increased dramatically. What had started as occasional mild nausea evolved into violent episodes of vomiting, severe abdominal pain, and periods of confusion and disorientation that lasted for several days at a time. I visited our family physician twice during this period, describing my symptoms and asking for tests that might identify the underlying cause of my recurring illness. Dr. Patricia Wong conducted routine blood work and physical examinations, but the results indicated normal ranges for most standard health markers. "Rebecca," Dr. Wong explained after reviewing my test results, "your blood work looks normal, and your physical examination does not reveal any obvious health problems. These symptoms might be related to stress, dietary changes, or other lifestyle factors. Try to maintain regular sleep patterns, eat balanced meals, and consider whether work stress might be contributing to your physical symptoms." Dr. Wong's assessment was reasonable based on the information available to her, but it reinforced my parents' suggestions that my symptoms were related to stress, poor self-care, or constitutional weakness, rather than any serious underlying medical condition. My parents used Dr. Wong's assessment to intensify their criticism of my lifestyle choices and professional decisions. They argued that my recurring illness proved their concerns about my career path were justified, and that I was demonstrating the poor judgment they had always suspected I possessed. "You see, my father would say after my medical appointments, 'Even the doctor agrees that you are not managing your life properly. Your body is telling you that you are making poor choices about work and stress management.' My mother would add, 'Michelle never had these kinds of health problems when she was in medical school, even though she was working much harder than you are.' This shows the difference between someone who has the strength and discipline to succeed and someone who does not." These conversations reinforced my belief that my health problems reflected personal weakness rather than external causes, and they increased my dependence on my parents' support and guidance during periods when I felt physically and emotionally vulnerable. What I could not have known at the time was that my parents had been deliberately causing my symptoms by adding small amounts of ethylene glycol, the main component of automotive antifreeze, to my food and beverages. They had researched the effects of antifreeze poisoning and understood that small, regular doses would produce the symptoms I was experiencing while remaining difficult to detect through routine medical testing. The poisoning campaign was carefully planned and methodically executed. My parents would add antifreeze to my meals during dinner preparation, ensuring that I consumed small amounts regularly while they consumed food that had not been contaminated. They understood that the symptoms of chronic low-level antifreeze poisoning could be attributed to stress, dietary issues, or other common health problems, making it unlikely that medical professionals would suspect intentional poisoning. More importantly, they understood that the psychological foundation they had established through years of emotional abuse made it virtually impossible for me to suspect that my own parents might be deliberately harming me. They had conditioned me to question my own perceptions and to accept their interpretations of my experiences, which meant that I was psychologically predisposed to accept their explanations for my symptoms rather than considering the possibility that they might be causing them. The systematic nature of their poisoning campaign became clear only after my hospitalization and the subsequent toxicology testing that revealed the presence of ethylene glycol in my system. The medical evidence indicated that I had been consuming antifreeze regularly for approximately 6 months, with concentrations that had been gradually increasing over time. This timing corresponded exactly with the period when my symptoms had evolved, from mild occasional discomfort to severe recurring episodes that left me completely debilitated for days at a time. My parents had been systematically escalating their poisoning campaign, apparently with the intention of ultimately causing my death in a way that would appear to be the result of natural illness or medical complications. The night that nearly ended my life occurred during what my parents called a special family dinner to celebrate your progress at work. I had recently completed a successful project at the marketing agency, and my supervisor had commended my creativity and professionalism in a way that represented genuine recognition of my capabilities. For once, I felt genuinely proud of my accomplishments and optimistic about my future prospects. I had been working on building confidence in my professional abilities, and the positive feedback from my supervisor felt like validation that I was capable of achieving success in my chosen career. My parents' invitation to celebrate this achievement felt like a significant departure from their usual criticism and disapproval. They seemed genuinely pleased with my success and interested in acknowledging my accomplishments in a positive way. "Rebecca," my mother said when she invited me to the celebration dinner, "we want to show you how proud we are of your hard work. Let us prepare a special meal to celebrate your success at the agency." The dinner they prepared included several of my favorite foods, presented with care and attention that suggested genuine celebration rather than obligation. My parents were unusually pleasant and encouraging during the meal, asking about my work projects and expressing interest in my future career plans. However, approximately 30 minutes after finishing dinner, I began experiencing symptoms that were more severe than anything I had previously encountered. The nausea and dizziness that had become familiar over the previous months were accompanied by severe abdominal pain, difficulty breathing, and periods of confusion that made it impossible for me to think clearly or communicate effectively. My parents initially responded with their usual concern and attentiveness, suggesting that I rest and offering to prepare remedies that had helped during previous episodes. However, as my symptoms continued to worsen, I became increasingly disoriented and began experiencing what I later learned were seizures caused by antifreeze poisoning. At that point, my parents could no longer maintain the pretense that my symptoms represented routine illness. They called emergency services and accompanied me to the hospital, where medical staff immediately recognized that I was experiencing symptoms consistent with severe poisoning. The emergency room physician, Dr. Michael Stevens, ordered comprehensive toxicology testing along with blood work and other diagnostic procedures designed to identify the cause of my symptoms. The toxicology results revealed significant concentrations of ethylene glycol in my system, along with metabolic changes consistent with antifreeze poisoning. "Ms. Chen," Dr. Stevens explained when I regained consciousness several hours after my arrival at the hospital, "you have been poisoned with ethylene glycol, which is the main component of antifreeze. The levels in your system indicate that you have been consuming this substance regularly over an extended period of time." The doctor's words initially seemed impossible to comprehend. I had no memory of consuming antifreeze, and I could not imagine how such a substance could have entered my system accidentally. However, Dr. Stevens explained that antifreeze poisoning typically occurs through deliberate consumption or contamination of food and beverages. This type of poisoning, he continued, usually results from intentional ingestion or from someone deliberately adding antifreeze to food or drinks. Given the concentrations and the pattern we see in your blood work, this appears to be the result of regular, ongoing exposure rather than a single incident. As I processed Dr. Stevens' explanation, the reality of my situation began to emerge with terrifying clarity. Someone had been deliberately poisoning me for months, causing the symptoms that I had attributed to stress and poor health management. The person responsible had access to my food and beverages on a regular basis, and had been systematically escalating the poisoning over time. The only people with consistent access to my meals were my parents, who had been preparing most of my food and expressing concern about my health throughout the period when the poisoning had been occurring. The realization that my own parents had been trying to kill me was so shocking and devastating that I initially refused to accept it as possible. However, as Dr. Stevens provided more details about antifreeze poisoning and the evidence from my toxicology tests, the pattern became undeniable. My parents had been systematically poisoning me while pretending to be concerned about my health and well-being. That night, as I lay in the hospital bed processing the medical evidence and the implications of what had been done to me, I experienced a transformation that would change every aspect of my life. The realization that I had survived a murder attempt by my own parents was devastating, but it also revealed the extraordinary strength and resilience I possessed. I understood that I had not only survived 6 months of systematic poisoning, but I had continued to work, to build professional relationships, and to maintain hope for my future even while my own family was trying to kill me. The courage and determination that had sustained me through this ordeal were evidence of capabilities I had never recognized in myself. More importantly, I realized that the psychological foundation my parents had established through years of emotional abuse was designed to prevent me from recognizing and responding to their escalating campaign of physical harm. They had conditioned me to doubt my own perceptions and to accept their interpretations of my experiences specifically so that I would not suspect them of deliberately causing my symptoms. Understanding the systematic nature of their psychological and physical abuse revealed that everything I had been told about my inadequacies, my poor judgment, and my dependence on their support was part of a deliberate strategy to maintain control over my life and prevent me from developing the independence necessary to escape their influence. That night in the hospital, I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. I would not return to my parents' house. I would not accept their explanations or apologies, and I would not allow them to continue controlling my life through fear, guilt, or manipulation. Instead, I would use the strength and resilience that had sustained me through their murder attempt to build a life based on my own values, goals, and judgment. I would prove to myself and to the world that I was capable of achieving success and happiness without their approval or support. The journey from that hospital bed to the independent, confident woman I am today was challenging and sometimes frightening, but it was also the most empowering experience of my life. Every step forward was evidence that I possessed capabilities my parents had tried to convince me I lacked. Today, I am not only alive but thriving in ways that would have been impossible if I had remained under my parents' control. The strength I discovered that night in the hospital has enabled me to build a career, relationships, and a life that reflect my authentic values and aspirations. This is the story of how I transformed from my parents' victim into the strongest version of myself, and how that transformation revealed possibilities I had never imagined when I believed their lies about my worth and capabilities. The story I need to tell you requires understanding how my relationship with my parents had not always been characterized by abuse and manipulation. There was a time, particularly during my high school and early college years, when our family dynamic appeared genuinely supportive and nurturing. Those years created the foundation of trust and emotional dependency that would later make it possible for my parents to systematically destroy my sense of self-worth and nearly end my life. During my sophomore year at Lincoln High School, I discovered my passion for visual arts and graphic design through an elective course taught by Mrs. Sarah Martinez, a professional designer who had returned to teaching after 15 years working for advertising agencies in San Francisco. Mrs. Martinez recognized something in my work that I had never seen in myself. She would spend extra time after class helping me develop my technical skills and encouraging me to explore creative approaches that pushed beyond the basic requirements of our assignments. My parents initially responded to my artistic interests with genuine enthusiasm and pride. When I showed them my first serious design project, a poster series for the school's environmental awareness campaign, my mother examined each piece carefully and told me she was impressed by my creativity and attention to detail. My father, who rarely commented on academic work that did not directly relate to mathematics or science, said that my design showed professional quality and sophisticated thinking. "Rebecca," he said while studying the posters I had spread across our dining room table, "these look like something you would see in a real advertising campaign. You have developed skills that could lead to a meaningful career." This validation from my parents felt extraordinary because they typically reserved their praise and encouragement for my sister Michelle, whose academic achievements in science and mathematics aligned more closely with their values and expectations. For the first time in my memory, I was receiving recognition for capabilities that were uniquely mine rather than comparison to Michelle's accomplishments. Mrs. Martinez encouraged me to enter several design competitions during my junior and senior years, and my work consistently received recognition from professional organizations and academic institutions. I won first place in the Oregon High School Design Competition 2 years in succession, received a regional award from the American Institute of Graphic Arts, and was featured in a showcase of outstanding student work published by the Portland Art Museum. Each of these achievements generated tremendous pride and excitement from my parents. They would display my awards prominently in our living room, discuss my accomplishments with relatives and colleagues, and frequently tell me how proud they were of my dedication and talent. My father began describing my design work as evidence that I had inherited his analytical abilities and attention to detail, while my mother would tell her friends that both of her daughters possessed exceptional capabilities in their chosen fields. The summer before my senior year, Mrs. Martinez helped me secure an internship with a small design firm in downtown Portland. The internship provided my first exposure to professional design work and client relationships, and I discovered that I possess natural abilities for understanding client needs, developing creative solutions, and managing project deadlines effectively. My supervisor at the design firm, Jennifer Walsh, was impressed with my professionalism and creative problem-solving skills. At the end of the internship, she told me that my work had exceeded her expectations for a high school student, and that she would provide strong recommendations for college applications and future employment opportunities. When I shared Jennifer's feedback with my parents, their response exceeded anything I had experienced in terms of pride and recognition. My mother called several relatives to share the news about my successful internship, while my father spent an entire evening asking detailed questions about the projects I had completed and the skills I had developed. "Rebecca," my mother said during one of these conversations, "we always knew you had special talents, but now we can see that you also have the discipline and professionalism necessary to build a successful career. We are so proud of how hard you have worked to develop these abilities." This period of recognition and encouragement continued throughout my senior year and into my college experience at Portland State University. My parents supported my decision to major in graphic design, helped me research the most respected programs, and expressed confidence that I would excel in my chosen field. During my freshman year at Portland State, I maintained regular contact with my parents through weekly phone calls and monthly visits home. They would ask about my coursework, my professors, and my progress on major projects. When I shared examples of my work with them, they would respond with detailed feedback and genuine enthusiasm about my creative development. My academic performance during college was consistently strong, earning recognition on the Dean's List for 5 consecutive semesters and receiving awards for outstanding work in advanced design courses. My professors frequently commended my technical skills, creative vision, and professional approach to project management. Professor David Kim, who taught the senior capstone course in graphic design, selected my portfolio as one of 3 exceptional examples to be featured in the university's annual showcase of student work. He told me that my design solutions demonstrated sophisticated understanding of visual communication principles and that my technical execution was among the best he had seen in 15 years of teaching. When I shared this recognition with my parents, they responded with the same pride and enthusiasm they had shown throughout my high school and early college years. They attended the portfolio showcase event, spent considerable time examining other students' work, and told me afterward that my projects were clearly among the most impressive in the exhibition. My father, who had always been reserved in his expressions of approval, told me that evening that he was genuinely proud of my accomplishments and impressed by the professional quality of my work. He said that my success in college demonstrated that I possessed the discipline and capabilities necessary to build a meaningful career and achieve financial independence. The validation and support I received from my parents during this period created a foundation of trust and emotional dependency that would prove crucial to their later campaign of psychological manipulation. I had learned to value their approval and to seek their guidance when making important decisions about my education and career direction. More importantly, their consistent encouragement had convinced me that they were genuinely invested in my success and well-being. The possibility that they might have ulterior motives for their support, or that their affection might be conditional on maintaining control over my life, never occurred to me during these years of apparent harmony and mutual respect. The first subtle indications that our relationship might be evolving in concerning directions emerged during the final months of my college experience. As graduation approached and I began actively seeking employment in the design field, my parents started expressing reservations about my career plans that differed significantly from their previous enthusiasm. Initially, these concerns seemed reasonable and reflected legitimate parental worry about my financial stability and professional development. They would ask questions about salary expectations, career advancement opportunities, and the long-term viability of working in creative industries. "Rebecca," my mother said during one of our conversations about my job search, "we want to make sure you understand the challenges of building a career in design. The competition is intense, and many talented people struggle to find stable employment that provides adequate income and benefits." My father would express similar concerns, focusing particularly on the financial aspects of working in creative fields. He would compare the typical salaries for graphic designers with the income potential available in more traditional professions like accounting, engineering, or business management. "I am not trying to discourage you," he would explain, "but I want you to make realistic decisions about your future. Creative work can be personally fulfilling, but you also need to consider whether it will provide the financial security necessary to support yourself independently." These conversations initially felt like reasonable expressions of parental concern, and I appreciated their interest in helping me make informed decisions about my career. However, as graduation approached, their questions and suggestions began to feel more directive and controlling. They started proposing alternative career paths that would utilize my analytical abilities rather than my creative skills. My father suggested that I should consider pursuing additional education in business administration or marketing, which would provide more diverse employment opportunities and better long-term earning potential. My mother began sharing articles about successful professionals who had started in creative fields but ultimately achieved greater success by transitioning into business management or consulting roles. She would highlight examples of people who had used their creative backgrounds as foundations for building more lucrative and stable careers in corporate environments. "Rebecca," she would say while showing me these articles, "you have developed excellent skills in design, but you could use those skills as stepping stones to more significant opportunities. Creative abilities are valuable in many business contexts, not just in traditional design roles." Initially, I interpreted these suggestions as evidence of my parents' sophisticated understanding of career development and their desire to help me maximize my professional potential. However, as their proposals became more specific and insistent, I began to feel that they were attempting to redirect my career path away from my actual interests and goals. The most concerning development occurred during my final semester, when my parents began expressing doubt about my decision to seek employment with design firms rather than pursuing opportunities in more traditional business environments. They suggested that my focus on creative work reflected immaturity and unrealistic expectations about professional life. My father, who had previously praised my design skills and encouraged my creative development, began characterizing my artistic abilities as hobbies rather than professional capabilities. He would suggest that creative work was appropriate for personal fulfillment, but not suitable as the foundation for a serious career. "Rebecca," he said during one particularly troubling conversation, "you need to distinguish between work that you enjoy and work that will provide the stability and income necessary for adult responsibilities. Design can be a wonderful creative outlet, but you should consider whether it represents a realistic career path." These conversations were confusing and hurtful because they contradicted years of encouragement and validation that had led me to believe my parents supported my career goals. However, I attributed their changing perspective to reasonable concern about my transition from student to professional and their desire to ensure I was prepared for the challenges of independent adult life. The graduation ceremony in June represented what I thought would be a celebration of my achievements and the beginning of an exciting phase of professional development. I had completed my degree with honors, received recognition for outstanding work in my major, and secured employment with a small but respected design firm in downtown Portland. My parents attended the graduation ceremony and appeared proud and supportive during the various events and celebrations. They took numerous photographs, introduced me to relatives and family friends as their accomplished daughter, and expressed enthusiasm about my upcoming employment opportunity. However, during the weeks following graduation, their behavior began shifting in ways that would ultimately reveal the true nature of their intentions and their attitude toward my independence and success. The supportive, encouraging parents who had celebrated my achievements during high school and college gradually began to be replaced by critical, controlling individuals who seemed threatened by my potential for independent success. The transition was so gradual that I did not initially recognize it as a deliberate change in strategy. Instead, I interpreted their increasing criticism and control as temporary adjustment difficulties related to my transition from student to working professional. When I started my job at the design firm, my parents began asking detailed questions about my daily activities, my colleagues, my supervisor, and my specific work assignments. Initially, these questions seemed to reflect reasonable interest in my professional development, but they gradually became more intrusive and judgmental. My mother would ask me to describe my interactions with clients, then offer suggestions about how I should modify my communication style to appear more professional and competent. My father would review examples of my work projects and provide feedback that increasingly focused on perceived shortcomings rather than acknowledging successful outcomes. Rebecca, my mother would say after examining my latest design projects, you need to be more careful about attention to detail. Clients will notice small mistakes, and they will question your professionalism if your work is not perfect. My father would add observations about the commercial viability of my design solutions, often suggesting that my creative approaches were too unconventional or sophisticated for typical business clients. Remember, he would explain, most clients prefer conservative, traditional approaches rather than experimental or artistic solutions. You need to focus on giving clients what they expect, rather than trying to impress them with unusual creativity. This feedback was particularly troubling because it contradicted the positive responses I was receiving from my actual clients and supervisor at the design firm. Jennifer Walsh, who had become my direct supervisor after my successful internship, consistently praised my creative problem-solving abilities and told me that clients were impressed with the quality and originality of my work. However, my parents' criticism was so consistent and detailed that I began questioning my own perceptions of my professional performance. They had established themselves as reliable sources of guidance and feedback throughout my academic development, which made it difficult for me to dismiss their concerns even when they conflicted with positive feedback from my workplace. This pattern of undermining my confidence while maintaining the appearance of supportive concern would prove to be the foundation for the systematic psychological abuse that would begin in earnest several months later. My parents were establishing the conditions that would make it possible for them to convince me that my professional struggles, health problems, and emotional difficulties were the result of my own inadequacies, rather than their deliberate campaign of manipulation and harm. The summer and fall following my college graduation represented the final period when our family relationship retained any semblance of normalcy or mutual respect. By winter, the psychological abuse would be well established, and by the following summer, the physical abuse through systematic poisoning would begin. Looking back now, I can see that my parents had been planning this campaign of abuse for months or perhaps years before they began implementing it. The encouragement and support they provided during my high school and college years had created the emotional dependency and trust that would make their later manipulation possible. They understood that I valued their approval and relied on their guidance, which meant that they could undermine my confidence and judgment gradually without triggering the defensive responses that might have occurred if they had attempted to control and manipulate me without first establishing trust and dependency. The systematic nature of their approach demonstrates that their abuse was not the result of mental illness, substance abuse, or uncontrolled emotional reactions. Instead, it was a calculated campaign designed to maintain control over my life, while ultimately eliminating me as a potential source of embarrassment or disappointment to their family reputation. Understanding this timeline and the deliberate nature of their strategy has been crucial to my recovery and transformation. It has helped me recognize that nothing I did or failed to do caused their abuse, and that their behavior reflected their own psychological problems rather than any inadequacies on my part. More importantly, it has shown me that the strength and resilience I demonstrated during the abuse were evidence of capabilities that had always existed within me, even during the periods when I accepted my parents' characterizations of my inadequacies and limitations. The girl who won design competitions in high school, excelled academically in college, and successfully transitioned to professional employment, was the same person who would ultimately survive their murder attempt and build an independent, successful life. My parents' abuse had temporarily obscured my capabilities, but it had not destroyed them. This realization became the foundation for everything I would accomplish after my hospitalization and escape from their control. The confidence and determination that would enable me to rebuild my life were not new qualities that I developed in response to trauma, but rather authentic aspects of my personality that had been suppressed by years of systematic manipulation. Recovery meant rediscovering and embracing the person I had always been, rather than becoming someone entirely different. The strength that enabled my transformation had sustained me through years of abuse, and it would prove more than adequate for the challenges of building an independent, authentic life. The transformation in my parents' behavior from supportive encouragement to systematic undermining occurred so gradually that I initially attributed each concerning incident to temporary stress, misunderstandings, or natural adjustments to my transition into professional life. What I failed to recognize at the time was that their campaign to erode my confidence and self-worth was deliberate, methodical, and designed to create psychological conditions that would make me vulnerable to escalating manipulation and control. The first significant indication that my parents' perspective on my career and capabilities had fundamentally changed occurred approximately 6 weeks after I began working at Morrison Design Associates. I had successfully completed my first major client project, developing a comprehensive brand identity package for a local restaurant group that included logo design, menu layouts, signage concepts, and digital marketing materials. The client, restaurant owner Maria Santos, was exceptionally pleased with my work and specifically commended my ability to understand her vision while creating designs that exceeded her expectations. She told Jennifer Walsh, my supervisor, that my designs had captured exactly the sophisticated but approachable aesthetic she had been seeking, and that she looked forward to working with our firm on future projects. Jennifer shared Maria's feedback with me during our weekly progress review, emphasizing that client satisfaction at this level was unusual for someone with my limited professional experience. She explained that my ability to translate abstract client concepts into compelling visual solutions demonstrated natural talent and professional instincts that typically required years of experience to develop. When I shared this positive feedback with my parents during our weekly family dinner, their response was markedly different from the enthusiasm and pride they had consistently shown throughout my academic achievements. Instead of celebrating my professional success, they immediately began questioning whether the client's satisfaction reflected genuine approval or merely politeness toward a new employee. My father examined the design materials I had brought home to share with them, studying each piece with an expression that suggested he was searching for flaws, rather than appreciating the creative solutions I had developed. After several minutes of silent evaluation, he began identifying what he characterized as weaknesses and missed opportunities in my work. "Rebecca," he said while pointing to specific elements in the logo design, "this approach seems overly complicated for a restaurant brand. Most successful food businesses use simpler, more direct visual identities that customers can remember easily." My mother added her own concerns about the color palette I had selected, suggesting that the sophisticated burgundy and gold combination I had chosen might appear too expensive or intimidating for casual dining customers. "You need to remember," she explained, "that most restaurant customers are looking for comfortable, familiar experiences rather than artistic sophistication. Your designs might be too refined for the actual target market." Their criticism was detailed and persistent, covering every aspect of my design decisions from typography choices to layout proportions. They presented their feedback as constructive guidance intended to help me develop better professional judgment, but their tone and focus suggested disapproval rather than support. Most troubling was their dismissal of the client's positive response as potentially misleading or uninformed. They suggested that Maria Santos might have expressed satisfaction because she lacked experience evaluating professional design work, or because she felt obligated to be polite about work that had already been completed. "Rebecca," my father explained, "you cannot rely entirely on client feedback to evaluate the quality of your work. Many business owners are not sophisticated about design principles, and they might not recognize problems until they see how customers respond to the final materials." This response was particularly confusing because it contradicted both the professional validation I had received at work and my parents' previous enthusiasm about my creative abilities. Throughout high school and college, they had consistently praised my design work and expressed confidence in my artistic judgment. The sudden shift to detailed criticism and skepticism about my professional competence felt jarring and inexplicable. However, I attributed their concerns to reasonable parental worry about my career development and their desire to ensure I maintained high standards for professional work. I assumed that their critical perspective reflected their care for my success, rather than any intentional attempt to undermine my confidence. This pattern of responding to my professional achievements with criticism and doubt became increasingly consistent over the following months. Each time I shared positive feedback from clients or recognition from my colleagues, my parents would identify potential problems with my work or question whether the positive responses reflected genuine approval. When I received a salary increase after 3 months of employment, they suggested that the modest raise might indicate that my supervisor felt obligated to provide some recognition while remaining concerned about my overall performance. When I was assigned to work on a larger, more prestigious client project, they warned me about the increased pressure and visibility that might expose weaknesses in my skills and experience. Rebecca, my mother said when I told them about my expanded responsibilities, you need to be very careful about taking on projects that might be beyond your current capabilities. If you fail on a high-profile assignment, it could damage your reputation and make it difficult to recover professionally. My father expressed similar concerns about my ability to handle increased expectations and client demands. He suggested that my enthusiasm about new opportunities might reflect inexperience, rather than realistic assessment of my professional readiness. Success in business requires understanding your limitations and working within them, he explained. Overconfidence can be more dangerous than excessive caution, especially early in your career. These conversations gradually began affecting my confidence and decision-making at work. I started second-guessing my creative instincts and seeking additional approval from Jennifer before presenting concepts to clients. I became increasingly anxious about client meetings and presentations, worried that my parents' concerns about my professional limitations might be accurate. The psychological impact of their consistent criticism was compounded by their strategy of mixing negative feedback with expressions of care and concern for my well-being. They would present their critical observations as evidence of their love and investment in my success, making it difficult for me to reject their guidance without feeling ungrateful or defensive. My mother would often preface her criticism by saying, "We only point out these concerns because we care about you and want to see you succeed." Other people might not be honest enough to help you recognize areas where you need to improve. My father would similarly frame his negative feedback as protective guidance, explaining that his business experience enabled him to identify potential problems that I might not recognize due to my limited professional experience. This approach was particularly effective because it made any resistance to their criticism appear immature and unreasonable. If I suggested that their concerns might be excessive or unfounded, they would characterize my response as evidence that I was not ready to receive constructive feedback and needed to develop stronger professional maturity. The erosion of my confidence accelerated significantly when my parents began comparing my professional performance to my sister Michelle's achievements in medical school and her residency program. These comparisons were presented as motivational examples intended to inspire me to higher levels of professional excellence. But their actual effect was to reinforce their suggestions that I was falling short of acceptable standards for success. During family dinners, they would share updates about Michelle's accomplishments in her residency program, emphasizing her dedication, her positive evaluations from supervising physicians, and her growing reputation among colleagues and patients. They would highlight specific examples of her professional recognition, research contributions, and leadership responsibilities. Michelle received another outstanding evaluation from her supervising physician this month. My mother would announce during our weekly dinner conversations, her dedication and competence are being recognized by everyone in the program. My father would add details about Michelle's research projects, conference presentations, and the respect she was earning from established physicians in her specialty. He would emphasize that her success reflected the strong work ethic and professional judgment that their parenting had instilled in both of their daughters. "Both of you girls have been raised with the same values and expectations," he would explain. Michelle's success shows what is possible when someone applies themselves fully to their professional development. These comparisons were particularly damaging because they implied that my more modest professional achievements reflected inadequate effort or commitment, rather than the natural differences between starting a creative career and completing medical training. The suggestion that Michelle's success demonstrated the potential that both daughters possessed made my slower professional progress appear to be a personal failure rather than a normal career development pattern. More insidious was their strategy of using these comparisons to question whether I was living up to the family's standards for professional excellence and personal responsibility. They would suggest that my satisfaction with my current job and salary might indicate that I lacked the ambition and drive necessary for significant career advancement. "Rebecca," my mother would say during these conversations, "we want to make sure you are pushing yourself to achieve your full potential. Sometimes comfort with current circumstances can prevent people from pursuing greater opportunities. My father would express concerns about whether my focus on creative satisfaction was preventing me from pursuing more lucrative or prestigious career paths. He would suggest that my contentment with my current position might reflect limited vision about my professional possibilities. Successful people are always looking for ways to advance and improve their situations, he would explain. Complacency can be the enemy of achievement, even when current circumstances seem satisfactory. These conversations gradually began affecting how I evaluated my own professional performance and career trajectory. I started questioning whether my satisfaction with my work at Morrison Design Associates reflected appropriate professional ambition or concerning lack of drive for advancement. The comparison to Michelle's achievements was particularly effective because it leveraged my existing admiration for my sister and my desire to make my parents proud. I had always respected Michelle's academic accomplishments and professional dedication, and I wanted to believe that I possessed similar capabilities for success in my chosen field. However, my parents' comparisons suggested that the differences between our professional trajectories reflected personal inadequacies on my part, rather than the natural variations between different career paths and individual personalities. This interpretation made me increasingly critical of my own achievements and dissatisfied with professional recognition that had previously felt meaningful and validating. The psychological foundation that my parents established through these months of systematic criticism and comparison created the perfect conditions for the next phase of their campaign, which would involve more direct attacks on my judgment, competence, and personal character. By undermining my confidence and my professional abilities, and creating doubt about my capacity for independent success, they were preparing me to accept more intensive control and manipulation. However, what my parents failed to understand was that their campaign of psychological abuse was actually revealing important information about their own character and motivations. The systematic nature of their criticism, the strategic timing of their negative feedback, and their consistent dismissal of external validation of my capabilities demonstrated that their behavior was not motivated by genuine concern for my well-being. Instead, their actions reflected a deliberate strategy to maintain control over my life and to prevent me from developing the confidence and independence that would enable me to build a successful adult life separate from their influence. The realization that their abuse was calculated rather than circumstantial would eventually become crucial to my ability to recognize the danger I was facing and to take decisive action to protect myself. During this period of escalating psychological manipulation, I was also developing professional skills and relationships that would prove essential to my eventual recovery and transformation. Jennifer Walsh continued to provide positive feedback and professional development opportunities that contradicted my parents' negative assessments of my capabilities. My colleagues at Morrison Design Associates treated me as a valued team member whose creative contributions enhanced our collective work product. Clients continued to respond positively to my design solutions and specifically requested my involvement in follow-up projects and expanded assignments. These external sources of validation created cognitive dissonance that made it increasingly difficult for me to accept my parents' characterizations of my professional limitations. The contrast between their criticism and the positive feedback I received at work forced me to question either their judgment or my own perceptions of reality. This internal tension would eventually become one of the factors that enabled me to recognize the abusive nature of their behavior and to trust my own judgment when making decisions about my safety and future. The professional confidence I was developing despite their psychological manipulation would provide a crucial foundation for the strength and determination I would need to survive their escalating campaign of abuse. The skills I was learning in my design work, particularly the ability to analyze complex problems and develop creative solutions under pressure, would prove directly applicable to the challenge of escaping their control and rebuilding my life independently. The client relationships I was building demonstrated my ability to communicate effectively, manage professional responsibilities, and earn respect through competence and reliability. Most importantly, the financial independence I was achieving through my employment, however modest, was creating practical options for autonomous decision-making that my parents were determined to eliminate. The steady income from my design work represented the potential for independent living arrangements that would remove me from their direct control and influence. Understanding this context helps explain why my parents' psychological abuse intensified significantly during this period and why they would eventually escalate to physical violence. Their campaign of criticism and manipulation was not achieving the level of control they required to prevent my eventual independence, which meant that more extreme measures would be necessary to maintain their dominance over my life and future. The systematic erosion of my confidence was designed to prepare me to accept those more extreme measures as reasonable responses to my inadequacies, rather than recognizing them as evidence of their dangerous intentions. However, the professional strength I was developing during this same period would ultimately prove stronger than their psychological manipulation, enabling me to survive their murder attempt and transform that experience into the foundation for authentic success and independence. The psychological manipulation that had characterized my parents' behavior during the initial months of my professional career evolved into something far more intrusive and controlling, as they recognized that their campaign of criticism and comparison was not achieving the level of dominance they required. What began as strategic undermining of my confidence transformed into direct interference with my professional relationships, personal decisions, and daily activities. The transition to more aggressive control tactics became apparent when my parents began requesting detailed information about my work schedule, client meetings, and project assignments. These inquiries were presented as reasonable parental interest in my professional development, but their scope and persistence exceeded normal family curiosity about career progress. My mother would ask specific questions about my daily activities, including the names of clients I was working with, the nature of my project assignments, and the timeline for completing various deliverables. She would request copies of my design work to review at home, explaining that she wanted to understand the type of projects I was handling and provide feedback that might help me improve my professional performance. My father began asking detailed questions about my income, expenses, and financial management practices. He would review my bank statements and pay stubs when I brought them home, ostensibly to help me develop better budgeting skills and long-term financial planning strategies. Rebecca, he would explain while examining my financial documents, young professionals often struggle with money management because they lack experience with budgeting and saving. I want to make sure you are making responsible decisions about spending and preparing adequately for future financial needs. These financial reviews gradually became more comprehensive and invasive. My father would question individual purchases, critique my spending priorities, and suggest modifications to my budget allocation that would increase my monthly contribution to household expenses, while reducing my personal savings and discretionary spending. When I expressed concern about these financial arrangements, my parents would remind me of the generous rental terms they were providing, and emphasize that my contributions to household expenses were still substantially lower than what I would pay for independent housing. They would suggest that my resistance to their budgeting guidance demonstrated immaturity and poor judgment about financial responsibility. My mother would add that their involvement in my financial planning was temporary assistance designed to help me develop skills that would serve me throughout my adult life. She would explain that many young professionals make costly financial mistakes because they lack proper guidance during their early career years. We are trying to help you avoid the problems that other people your age experience when they have complete independence before they are ready for those responsibilities, she would say. Financial mistakes can have consequences that last for years, and we want to protect you from those difficulties. This justification for their financial control was particularly effective because it appealed to my desire to make responsible decisions and avoid the financial struggles that affected many of my college friends. However, their budgeting recommendations consistently reduced my ability to save money for eventual independent living, while increasing my financial dependence on their household arrangement. The escalation of their control tactics became more apparent when they began interfering directly with my professional relationships and work commitments. My parents started expressing concerns about the time I was spending at the office, suggesting that my dedication to work projects might indicate that I was struggling to complete assignments efficiently, or that my supervisor was taking advantage of my inexperience. My mother would question whether my evening and weekend work was necessary or whether it reflected poor time management and planning skills. She would suggest that competent professionals should be able to complete their assignments during regular business hours without requiring additional time for project work. Rebecca, she would say when I worked late or brought projects home to complete, you need to consider whether you are being realistic about your capabilities and workload management. If you cannot complete your assignments during normal business hours, that might indicate that you are accepting responsibilities that are beyond your current skill level. My father would express similar concerns, focusing particularly on whether my supervisor was providing adequate support and guidance for project management. He would suggest that my need to work additional hours might reflect insufficient training or unrealistic expectations from management. These concerns about my work schedule were particularly troubling because they contradicted the positive feedback I was receiving from Jennifer and my colleagues about my dedication and work quality. The additional time I spent on projects was typically voluntary effort to ensure exceptional results, rather than compensation for inadequate skills or poor time management. However, my parents' persistent questions about my work habits gradually began affecting my confidence about professional priorities and time management. I started questioning whether my commitment to producing high-quality work reflected appropriate professional dedication or concerning inability to work efficiently within normal parameters. The interference with my professional relationships escalated when my parents began suggesting that I should be more selective about after-work socializing with colleagues and more cautious about developing personal friendships with coworkers. They expressed concerns that casual social relationships with professional colleagues could create complications that might affect my reputation or career advancement opportunities. My mother would warn me about the potential risks of becoming too friendly with coworkers, suggesting that personal relationships in professional environments often led to conflicts of interest, gossip, and divided loyalties that could damage career prospects. "Rebecca," she would explain, "you need to maintain appropriate boundaries between your professional responsibilities and personal relationships. Many young professionals make mistakes by treating their workplace like a social environment rather than focusing on their career development." My father would express similar reservations about my participation in office social events, team-building activities, and informal gatherings with colleagues. He would suggest that my time and energy would be better invested in skill development and professional education, rather than casual socializing that provided no direct career benefits. These recommendations gradually began isolating me from the collegial relationships that had been developing naturally at Morrison Design Associates. I started declining invitations to join colleagues for lunch, after-work drinks, or weekend social activities, explaining that I needed to focus on my professional responsibilities and career development. The isolation from workplace friendships had several concerning consequences that my parents had apparently anticipated and desired. Without casual relationships with colleagues, I had fewer opportunities to receive informal feedback about my work performance, and fewer sources of perspective about normal professional expectations and workplace dynamics. More importantly, the reduction in social connections at work meant that I had fewer people who might notice changes in my behavior, health, or emotional state. The colleagues who had begun to know me personally were the most likely to recognize signs of distress or abuse, making their continued friendship a potential threat to my parents, increasing control over my life. The systematic isolation from professional relationships was accompanied by similar interference with my personal friendships and social activities. My parents began expressing concerns about the time I was spending with college friends, and questioning whether these relationships were appropriate for someone who was focusing seriously on career development and adult responsibilities. They would suggest that many of my college friendships were based on shared experiences that were no longer relevant to my current life circumstances, and that maintaining these relationships might prevent me from developing more mature social connections appropriate to my professional status. My mother would express concerns about specific friends, particularly those who were pursuing creative careers, or who appeared to have more relaxed attitudes toward financial responsibility and career planning. She would suggest that their influence might encourage me to make poor decisions about my own professional priorities and life goals. "Rebecca," she would say when discussing my social plans, "you need to consider whether your friends are moving in the same direction as you are professionally and personally. Sometimes childhood friendships can hold people back from growing and developing in ways that are appropriate for their adult lives." My father would add observations about the potential negative influence of friends who were struggling with career development, financial stability, or personal relationships. He would suggest that maintaining close connections with people who were making poor life choices could affect my own judgment and decision-making. These concerns about my friendships were presented as protective guidance intended to help me build social relationships that would support my professional growth and personal development. However, their actual effect was to create isolation from external sources of perspective and support that might have helped me recognize the increasingly concerning nature of their behavior. As my social connections weakened due to their interference and my own internalization of their concerns, I became increasingly dependent on my parents' approval and guidance for emotional support and social interaction. The isolation they were creating made their opinions and perspectives more influential because I had fewer alternative sources of feedback and validation. The escalation to direct control reached a critical point when my parents began making unilateral decisions about my personal life and professional commitments without consulting me or seeking my consent. These decisions were presented as temporary assistance designed to help me manage responsibilities that were becoming overwhelming, but they represented fundamental violations of my autonomy and independence. The most significant incident occurred when my mother contacted Jennifer Walsh directly to discuss concerns about my work schedule and stress levels. She explained to my supervisor that she had noticed signs of strain and fatigue that suggested I might be taking on more responsibility than I could handle effectively. My mother told Jennifer that she was worried about my health and well-being, and that she wanted to ensure that workplace expectations were reasonable for someone with my level of experience and capability. She suggested that reducing my project load or providing additional support might help me manage my responsibilities more effectively. Jennifer was surprised by this contact because she had not observed any signs of stress or performance problems in my work. She told my mother that my performance had been consistently excellent and that she had not noticed any indication that I was struggling with workload management or project demands. When Jennifer mentioned this conversation to me during our next weekly meeting, I was mortified by my mother's interference in my professional relationship. The contact violated professional boundaries and created the impression that I was unable to manage my own work responsibilities or communicate effectively with my supervisor about workplace concerns. More troubling was the realization that my mother had made this contact without discussing her concerns with me first, or seeking my permission to speak with my supervisor. The unilateral nature of her action demonstrated that she felt entitled to make decisions about my professional relationships without my knowledge or consent. When I confronted my parents about this incident, their response revealed how significantly their perception of our relationship had evolved. Instead of acknowledging that the contact was inappropriate or apologizing for violating professional boundaries, they defended their action as necessary intervention to protect my well-being and career prospects. My father explained that they had observed signs of stress and poor judgment that indicated I was not managing my professional responsibilities effectively. He suggested that their intervention was necessary because I had not demonstrated adequate maturity to recognize when I needed assistance or support. "Rebecca," he said, "we could see that you were struggling, but you were too proud or too inexperienced to ask for help. Sometimes parents need to step in when their children are not capable of managing situations independently." My mother added that their contact with Jennifer was motivated by love and concern for my success, and that my negative reaction to their assistance demonstrated that I was not ready for the level of independence I was trying to maintain. "We are not trying to control you," she explained. "We are trying to protect you from making mistakes that could damage your career and your future opportunities. If you were managing everything successfully, we would not need to be involved." This response was particularly concerning because it revealed that my parents no longer recognized my right to make independent decisions about my professional life and personal relationships. Their characterization of their interference as necessary protection suggested that they viewed me as incapable of managing adult responsibilities without their supervision and guidance. More ominously, their justification for this interference established a framework that could be used to rationalize increasingly invasive and controlling behavior. If they could convince themselves and others that their actions were motivated by protective concern rather than desire for control, they could escalate their interference while maintaining the appearance of caring parents helping a struggling young adult. The incident with Jennifer also demonstrated that my parents were willing to risk damaging my professional reputation and relationships in order to maintain control over my life. Their willingness to interfere with my work environment showed that their desire for dominance exceeded their concern for my actual career success and well-being. This realization marked a crucial turning point in my understanding of our family dynamic and my parents' true motivations. For the first time, I began to consider the possibility that their behavior might be driven by factors other than genuine concern for my success and happiness. However, the psychological foundation they had established through months of systematic criticism and isolation made it difficult for me to trust my own perceptions of their behavior. The doubt they had created about my judgment and capabilities made me question whether my concerns about their interference were justified, or whether they reflected the immaturity and poor judgment they had consistently attributed to me. This internal conflict between my instinctive recognition that their behavior was inappropriate and my learned dependence on their guidance would become increasingly intense as their control tactics continued to escalate. The resolution of this conflict would ultimately determine whether I would recognize the danger I was facing in time to take protective action, or whether I would continue to accept their control until their campaign of abuse achieved its ultimate objective. The escalation from psychological control to physical manifestations of abuse occurred through a progression so subtle and carefully orchestrated that I initially attributed my declining health to the stress of managing increasing tensions with my parents, alongside the demands of establishing my professional career. What I failed to recognize was that my parents had begun implementing a systematic campaign of physical harm, designed to complement their psychological manipulation while maintaining complete deniability about their intentions. The first physical symptoms appeared approximately 9 months after I had begun working at Morrison Design Associates, during a period when my professional confidence was gradually recovering despite my parents' continued efforts to undermine my self-assurance. I had successfully completed several high-profile client projects, received positive performance evaluations from Jennifer Walsh, and begun developing the workplace relationships that my parents had attempted to discourage through their interference and criticism. The initial symptoms manifested as occasional episodes of nausea and unusual fatigue that occurred seemingly without pattern or identifiable cause. These episodes would typically begin during evening hours after I returned home from work, starting with mild stomach discomfort that would gradually intensify into more severe nausea, accompanied by dizziness and exhaustion that made it difficult to concentrate on personal projects or maintain normal evening activities. The timing of these symptoms initially suggested that they might be related to work stress or dietary changes associated with my professional routine. However, their intensity and duration exceeded what would be expected from typical stress-related digestive issues, and they occurred even during periods when my workload was manageable and my professional relationships were positive and supportive. My parents responded to these early symptoms with expressions of concern and attentiveness that represented a marked departure from the critical and controlling behavior that had characterized their recent interactions with me. When I experienced episodes of nausea or fatigue, they would immediately shift into protective, nurturing roles that reminded me of their supportive behavior during my childhood illnesses. My mother would prepare special meals and herbal teas that she claimed would help alleviate my symptoms and restore my energy levels. She would encourage me to rest and would take over household responsibilities that I normally handled independently, creating an atmosphere of care and concern that felt genuine and comforting. "Rebecca," she would say while preparing these remedial meals, "you need to take better care of yourself. You have been working too hard and not paying enough attention to your health and nutrition. Let me help you get back to feeling strong and healthy." My father would express similar concern about my well-being, suggesting that my symptoms might indicate that I was pushing myself too hard professionally and needed to find better balance between work responsibilities and personal health maintenance. He would encourage me to consider reducing my work commitments temporarily while I recovered from what he characterized as exhaustion and stress-related illness. Perhaps he would suggest, "You should discuss with your supervisor the possibility of reducing your project load until you feel completely healthy again. Your career will benefit more from sustainable work practices than from pushing yourself beyond your physical limitations." Quote, "This caring response from my parents was particularly meaningful because it contrasted sharply with the criticism and control that had dominated our recent interactions. For the first time in months, they seemed primarily concerned with my well-being rather than focused on identifying my professional and personal shortcomings. The positive attention I received during these episodes of illness created a psychological dynamic that would prove crucial to my parents' ultimate strategy. Their nurturing behavior during my physical distress established a pattern where my suffering generated the supportive treatment that I had been missing from our relationship. creating unconscious associations between being unwell and receiving parental care and validation. However, what I could not have suspected at the time was that my parents were deliberately causing the symptoms that prompted their caring responses. They had begun adding small amounts of household chemicals to my food and beverages, carefully selecting substances that would produce the gastrointestinal distress and fatigue I was experiencing, while remaining virtually undetectable through casual observation or standard medical testing. The systematic nature of their poisoning campaign would not become apparent until much later, when the accumulation of toxins in my system produced symptoms severe enough to require emergency medical intervention. During these early months, the effects were carefully calibrated to create concerning but not immediately dangerous health problems that could be attributed to stress, dietary issues, or other common causes of digestive distress. My parents had apparently researched the effects of various household chemicals and identified substances that would produce the specific symptoms they wanted to create, while avoiding immediate medical complications that might prompt comprehensive testing or investigation. Their selection of toxins demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how to cause deliberate harm while maintaining plausible alternative explanations for my declining health. The progression of symptoms over the following months followed a pattern that suggested careful planning and gradual escalation rather than random occurrence or natural illness. The frequency of episodes increased from once or twice per month to weekly occurrences, while the intensity and duration of symptoms also escalated gradually but consistently. What had initially been mild nausea lasting a few hours evolved into severe digestive distress, accompanied by dizziness, confusion, and exhaustion that would leave me incapacitated for entire days. These more serious episodes would typically occur during weekends or evenings when I was not expected at work, minimizing the professional impact while maximizing the disruption to my personal life and independence. The timing of these escalating symptoms also corresponded with periods when I was making progress in rebuilding my confidence in establishing boundaries with my parents, controlling behavior. When I successfully resisted their attempts to interfere with my professional relationships, or when I demonstrated increased independence in personal decision-making, the frequency and severity of my health problems would increase accordingly. This correlation between my assertions of autonomy and my physical symptoms created a psychological association that reinforced my parents' messages about my inadequacy and dependence. When I felt strong and confident enough to challenge their control, I would subsequently become ill in ways that left me feeling vulnerable and grateful for their care and support. The poisoning campaign also served to isolate me from external sources of support and perspective that might have helped me recognize the abusive nature of my parents' behavior. When I was experiencing severe symptoms, I would cancel social plans with friends and colleagues, decline invitations to professional events, and avoid activities that required sustained energy or concentration. This isolation meant that fewer people had regular contact with me and opportunities to observe changes in my health, behavior, or emotional state. The colleagues and friends who might have noticed signs of abuse or offered alternative perspectives about my family dynamic had increasingly limited access to me during the periods when such support would have been most valuable. My parents encouraged this isolation by suggesting that rest and reduced social activity were necessary for my recovery from what they consistently characterized as stress-related illness brought on by overwork and poor self-care. They would recommend that I decline social invitations and focus my energy on recovering my health rather than maintaining demanding social and professional commitments. Rebecca, my mother would say when I considered attending social events despite feeling unwell, you need to prioritize your health over social obligations. Your friends will understand that you need to take care of yourself, and your recovery will be faster if you rest, rather than pushing yourself to maintain normal activities. My father would express similar concerns about the energy demands of social and professional activities during periods when I was experiencing symptoms. He would suggest that my desire to maintain normal commitments despite feeling ill demonstrated poor judgment about health management and self-care priorities. Successful people understand the importance of taking care of their physical health, he would explain. Pushing yourself to maintain social activities when you should be resting shows the kind of poor decision-making that can lead to more serious health problems. These recommendations seemed reasonable and caring, particularly because they were accompanied by genuine expressions of concern for my well-being and offers to provide practical support during my recovery periods. However, Their effect was to systematically eliminate the external relationships and activities that provided me with confidence, validation, and alternative perspectives about normal family dynamics and personal autonomy. The most concerning development during this period was the way my parents began using my health problems to justify increased control over my daily activities, professional commitments, and personal decisions. They would suggest that my recurring illness demonstrated that I was not managing my life effectively and needed additional guidance and supervision to prevent further health complications. When I experienced severe episodes of nausea and fatigue, my parents would take over responsibilities that I normally handled independently, including household tasks, personal errands, and even some aspects of managing my work schedule and client communications. They would present this assistance as temporary support during illness, but their involvement would often continue beyond my recovery periods. My mother would begin making decisions about my meals, personal schedule, and daily activities without consulting me, explaining that she wanted to ensure I was following appropriate health management practices and avoiding activities that might trigger additional symptoms. My father would review my work commitments and suggest modifications to my project schedule or client meetings that he believed would reduce stress and prevent recurrence of health problems. He would sometimes contact my workplace directly to inform them that I needed to adjust my schedule due to medical concerns. These interventions were presented as caring support from concerned parents who wanted to protect my health and career prospects. However, their actual effect was to reduce my independence and decision-making authority, while increasing my dependence on their judgment and assistance for managing basic aspects of adult life. The pattern that emerged during this period was particularly insidious, because it combined genuine physical distress with psychological manipulation, in ways that made it extremely difficult to maintain perspective about appropriate boundaries and normal family relationships. When I was experiencing severe symptoms, I felt genuinely grateful for my parents' care and support, which made it difficult to recognize or resist their increasing control over my life. The physical symptoms also provided my parents with seemingly legitimate justifications for their controlling behavior that made it difficult for me to articulate concerns about their interference without appearing ungrateful or unreasonable. When they made decisions about my schedule or activities without consulting me, they could point to my recurring illness as evidence that such supervision was necessary for my health and well-being. More troubling was the way the combination of physical symptoms and increased parental control began affecting my professional performance and workplace relationships. When I was experiencing severe episodes of illness, I would sometimes need to miss work or modify my project commitments, which created stress about meeting client expectations and maintaining professional reliability. My parents would suggest that these professional challenges demonstrated that my job was too demanding for someone with my health concerns, and that I should consider finding less stressful employment that would be more compatible with my medical needs. They would recommend positions that would reduce my income and professional autonomy while increasing my dependence on their financial support and housing arrangement. Rebecca, my father would say during discussions about my career and health concerns, "You need to be realistic about what kind of work environment is appropriate for someone with your medical issues. High-stress creative work might not be compatible with maintaining good health and managing your symptoms effectively." My mother would add suggestions about alternative career paths that would provide more stable schedules and less demanding client relationships. She would highlight examples of people who had found greater happiness and better health by choosing careers that prioritized work-life balance over professional achievement and financial advancement. These career recommendations were particularly concerning because they would have eliminated the professional independence and financial stability that represented my primary pathway to eventual autonomous living arrangements. The jobs they suggested would have made it impossible for me to save money for independent housing while increasing my long-term dependence on their support and guidance. However, during periods when I was experiencing severe physical symptoms, their suggestions about reducing professional stress seemed reasonable and caring, rather than controlling and manipulative. The combination of genuine physical distress and apparent parental concern made it difficult to maintain perspective about their true motivations and the long-term implications of following their guidance. The most significant consequence of this period was the way it established a psychological and practical foundation for the more intensive abuse that would follow. By creating regular episodes of illness that required their care and support, My parents had developed a system for justifying increased control while generating genuine gratitude and dependence that made it difficult for me to resist their influence. The isolation from external relationships and the reduction in professional confidence that resulted from my declining health created conditions that would make it extremely difficult for me to recognize the escalating danger or to seek help when their campaign of abuse intensified. The physical symptoms had become both a method of control and a barrier to escape that would prove crucial to their ultimate strategy. However, what my parents had not anticipated was that their campaign of deliberate poisoning would also provide the evidence that would eventually expose their intentions and enable my escape from their control. The systematic nature of my symptoms and their correlation with specific circumstances would ultimately create a pattern that medical professionals could identify and investigate. More importantly, the strength and resilience that enabled me to continue working and maintaining relationships, despite months of deliberate poisoning, demonstrated capabilities that my parents had consistently underestimated. The determination that sustained me through this period of systematic abuse would prove more than adequate for the challenges of rebuilding my life independently once I understood the true nature of what they had been doing to me. The transformation from carefully orchestrated illness to life-threatening emergency occurred during what should have been a celebration of my professional growth and increasing independence. The incident that would eventually open my eyes to the true nature of my parents' behavior happened on a Thursday evening in late November, approximately 14 months after I had begun working at Morrison Design Associates, and 6 months after my mysterious health problems had first appeared. I had recently achieved a significant milestone in my career development. Jennifer Walsh had informed me that morning that I would be promoted to senior graphic designer, with expanded responsibilities for client relationship management and project leadership. The promotion included a substantial salary increase that would, for the first time, provide me with sufficient income to seriously consider independent living arrangements while maintaining financial stability. The news of my promotion represented validation of capabilities that my parents had consistently questioned and undermined. Despite months of their criticism about my professional judgment and their interference with my workplace relationships, I had demonstrated competence that my supervisor and colleagues recognized and rewarded with increased responsibility and compensation. More significantly, the financial independence that accompanied my promotion would fundamentally alter the power dynamic between my parents and me. The increased income would enable me to afford market-rate housing in Portland while building savings for long-term financial security. For the first time since graduation, I would have genuine options for autonomous living that did not require their financial support or approval. When I shared the news of my promotion during our family dinner that evening, my parents' response provided the first clear indication that their behavior toward me was motivated by factors other than genuine concern for my success and well-being. Instead of expressing pride in my professional achievement or celebrating my career advancement, they immediately began questioning whether the promotion reflected actual recognition of my capabilities or represented a temporary arrangement that might not provide lasting career security. My father examined the details of my new position with the same critical scrutiny he had applied to my earlier professional achievements, focusing particularly on the increased responsibilities and whether I possessed adequate experience to manage the expanded role effectively. He suggested that accepting the promotion might expose weaknesses in my skills that had been overlooked in my previous position. "Rebecca," he said after listening to my description of the new responsibilities, "you need to consider whether this promotion represents genuine confidence in your abilities or whether your supervisor is simply responding to staffing needs by advancing someone who is available rather than truly qualified." My mother expressed similar reservations about the timing and nature of my promotion, suggesting that rapid career advancement often indicated that companies were struggling to retain experienced employees and were promoting junior staff members prematurely to fill vacant positions. "Sometimes," she explained, "organizations promote people quickly because they cannot find qualified external candidates, not because the person being promoted has demonstrated readiness for increased responsibility. You should be cautious about accepting duties that might be beyond your current capabilities." Their skepticism about my promotion was particularly troubling because it directly contradicted the positive feedback I had consistently received from clients, colleagues, and supervisors throughout my employment at Morrison Design Associates. The recognition I had earned was based on demonstrated competence and professional growth rather than organizational desperation or convenience. However, what made their response genuinely alarming was the way they began suggesting that my promotion might actually represent a problem that required their intervention rather than an achievement that deserved celebration. They implied that accepting increased responsibility in my current health condition might exacerbate the recurring illness I had been experiencing and could lead to professional failure that would damage my long-term career prospects. My father recommended that I should discuss with Jennifer the possibility of declining the promotion or negotiating modified responsibilities that would be more compatible with my medical concerns. He suggested that prioritizing my health over professional advancement represented mature decision-making that would benefit my career in the long term. My mother supported this recommendation, adding that the stress of managing increased responsibilities while dealing with ongoing health problems could create a cycle of declining performance that would ultimately harm my professional reputation and future opportunities. "Rebecca," she said, "we are concerned that you might be accepting this promotion because you feel pressured to advance quickly rather than because you genuinely believe you are ready for these responsibilities. Taking on too much too soon could set you up for failure." The conversation about my promotion continued throughout dinner, with both parents consistently emphasizing potential problems and risks, rather than acknowledging the professional recognition and financial benefits the advancement represented. Their focus on negative possibilities rather than positive outcomes created an atmosphere of anxiety and doubt that overshadowed what should have been a moment of celebration and confidence. However, the most concerning aspect of their response was the way they began suggesting that my promotion demonstrated poor judgment rather than professional competence. They implied that accepting increased responsibility while experiencing health problems reflected the kind of impulsive decision-making that had worried them throughout my early career development. This characterization of my promotion as evidence of poor judgment represented a fundamental shift in how they framed my professional achievements. Previously, they had criticized my work as inadequate or questioned whether positive feedback reflected genuine approval. Now they were suggesting that success itself demonstrated flawed decision-making and unrealistic self-assessment. The psychological impact of this response was profound, because it created a framework where any professional achievement could be reinterpreted as evidence of personal inadequacy. If success reflected poor judgment and failure reflected incompetence, then no professional outcome could provide genuine validation or confidence about my capabilities. Following dinner, I experienced the most severe episode of illness I had encountered since my health problems had begun 6 months earlier. The symptoms began within 30 minutes of finishing my meal, starting with intense nausea that quickly progressed to violent vomiting, accompanied by severe abdominal pain and dizziness that made it impossible to stand or walk steadily. The intensity and rapid onset of these symptoms exceeded anything I had previously experienced, creating genuine fear that I might be suffering from a serious medical emergency, rather than the stress-related digestive problems that had characterized my earlier episodes. The pain was so severe that I could not concentrate on conversation or maintain normal thought processes, and the dizziness created disorientation that made me concerned about losing consciousness. My parents responded to this medical crisis with immediate attention and apparent concern, but their behavior during the emergency revealed patterns that would eventually help me understand the true nature of what was happening to me. While they expressed worry about my condition and offered various remedies and treatments, they consistently discouraged me from seeking immediate medical attention or contacting healthcare professionals for guidance. My mother suggested that the symptoms, despite their severity, were likely related to the stress and excitement of my promotion announcement, combined with the ongoing health problems I had been managing. She recommended that I should rest and allow the episode to resolve naturally rather than creating additional stress through emergency medical consultations. My father supported this assessment, suggesting that emergency room physicians would likely attribute my symptoms to anxiety or stress-related digestive problems, and that the experience of seeking emergency care might actually exacerbate my condition rather than providing effective treatment. "Rebecca," he said, "while I was experiencing the most severe pain, emergency rooms are not well equipped to handle stress-related illness, and the doctors there will probably just give you medication that might make you feel worse. You should try to rest and see if the symptoms improve on their own." Their reluctance to seek immediate medical attention was particularly concerning because the severity of my symptoms clearly warranted professional medical evaluation. The combination of intense pain, persistent vomiting, and disorientation could have indicated various serious medical conditions that required prompt diagnosis and treatment. However, their insistence that the episode was related to stress and excitement rather than underlying medical problems was presented with such confidence and apparent concern for my well-being that I initially accepted their assessment, despite my instinctive feeling that something was seriously wrong with my condition. The episode lasted approximately 6 hours, during which my symptoms gradually decreased in intensity but left me feeling exhausted and disoriented in ways that persisted for several days following the acute phase. The experience was frightening enough that I began seriously considering whether my recurring health problems might indicate a more serious underlying medical condition that required comprehensive evaluation and treatment. However, my parents consistently discouraged medical investigation of my symptoms, suggesting that extensive testing and medical consultations might create additional anxiety that could worsen my condition. They recommended that I should focus on stress management and lifestyle modifications, rather than pursuing medical explanations for what they characterized as clearly stress-related illness. The timing of this severe episode, occurring immediately after I announced my promotion, and the financial independence it would provide, created the first clear correlation between my assertions of autonomy and the intensity of my physical symptoms. While I did not consciously recognize this pattern at the time, the connection would eventually become crucial to understanding the systematic nature of what my parents were doing to me. More importantly, the severity of this particular episode forced me to begin questioning whether my parents' explanations for my recurring illness were adequate or accurate. The intensity of the symptoms exceeded what would typically be expected from stress-related digestive problems, and the timing seemed too coincidental to be purely circumstantial. For the first time since my health problems had begun, I started considering the possibility that external factors, rather than personal stress, might be contributing to my symptoms. While I did not suspect deliberate poisoning, I began wondering whether environmental factors in our household, dietary issues, or other external influences might be affecting my health in ways that my parents had not considered or recognized. This shift toward questioning external factors rather than accepting personal stress as the complete explanation for my illness represented a crucial development in my psychological recovery from months of manipulation and control. The beginning of external attribution for my problems marked the first step toward recognizing that my parents' explanations might be incomplete or inaccurate. The days following this severe episode also provided important information about my parents' true priorities and concerns. Instead of encouraging me to investigate potential medical causes for my symptoms or supporting my desire to understand what was happening to my health, they intensified their efforts to convince me that medical evaluation was unnecessary and potentially harmful. They began providing more detailed explanations for why my symptoms were clearly stress-related, and why medical investigation would be counterproductive. These explanations were sophisticated and appeared well-researched, suggesting that they had prepared responses to potential questions about the medical aspects of my condition. My mother would explain that stress-related digestive problems often manifested in ways that could mimic more serious medical conditions, and that emergency room physicians often misdiagnose stress-related illness as organic medical problems, leading to unnecessary testing and inappropriate treatments. My father would add that the medical system was not well designed to address stress-related illness, and that physicians often pursued expensive and invasive testing procedures that created additional anxiety without providing effective treatment for the underlying stress that was causing the symptoms. These explanations were presented with apparent expertise and concern for preventing me from experiencing ineffective medical care. However, their sophistication and detail suggested preparation and research that seemed excessive for parents who were simply concerned about stress-related illness in their daughter. The pattern that emerged during the week following my severe episode was my parents' consistent discouragement of medical investigation combined with intensified efforts to convince me that my promotion represented a poor decision that would exacerbate my health problems and ultimately harm my career prospects. They suggested that the timing of my severe symptoms immediately following my promotion announcement demonstrated that increased professional responsibility was incompatible with my current health condition, and that accepting the advancement would likely lead to continued medical problems and eventual professional failure. This correlation between my career advancement and their health concerns revealed the first clear indication that their behavior might be motivated by factors other than genuine worry about my well-being. The suggestion that professional success would necessarily lead to health problems seemed designed to discourage achievement rather than promote recovery. More troubling was their recommendation that I should inform Jennifer Walsh that my health condition made it necessary to decline the promotion and request continuation in my current position with reduced responsibilities and stress levels. They suggested that honest communication about my medical limitations would be better for my long-term career prospects than attempting to manage increased responsibilities while dealing with ongoing health problems. Rebecca, my father explained, employers respect honesty about personal limitations more than they respect employees who take on responsibilities they cannot manage effectively. Jennifer will appreciate your maturity in recognizing that this promotion might not be appropriate for your current situation. This recommendation would have eliminated the financial independence that represented my primary pathway to autonomous living while reinforcing my dependence on their support and guidance. The suggestion that declining professional advancement reflected maturity rather than limitation was particularly manipulative because it reframed career regression as personal growth. The week following my severe episode became a turning point in my relationship with my parents, because it provided the first clear evidence that their behavior was designed to maintain control over my life, rather than promote my success and independence. Their discouragement of medical investigation combined with their efforts to convince me to decline my promotion revealed motivations that were inconsistent with genuine parental support. However, the psychological foundation they had established through months of systematic manipulation made it extremely difficult for me to trust my own perceptions of their behavior or to act on my growing concerns about their true intentions. The doubt they had created about my judgment and the dependence they had fostered through their care during my illness created powerful obstacles to recognizing the danger I was facing. The resolution of this internal conflict between my instinctive recognition of problems and my learned dependence on their guidance would determine whether I would take the steps necessary to protect myself from the escalating campaign of abuse they were implementing. The severe episode had provided crucial information about the systematic nature of my illness, but understanding and acting on that information would require overcoming months of psychological conditioning designed to prevent exactly that kind of independent analysis and decision-making. The weeks following my severe illness episode and my parents' disturbing response to my promotion marked the beginning of a systematic analysis that would fundamentally alter my understanding of the relationship between my health problems and my family dynamics. What began as casual observation of coincidences evolved into methodical documentation that revealed patterns too consistent to be explained by stress or circumstance alone. My decision to begin tracking my symptoms and their correlation with specific events emerged from a combination of professional analytical training and growing unease about the explanations my parents provided for my recurring illness. The graphic design work that had developed my attention to detail and pattern recognition capabilities proved directly applicable to understanding the systematic nature of what was happening to my health. I began maintaining a private journal that documented the timing, severity, and duration of each episode, along with detailed descriptions of the circumstances that preceded and followed each incident. This documentation process initially served as a method for identifying potential triggers that I could avoid or modify to prevent future episodes. The journal entries from late November and early December revealed correlations that were initially puzzling but became increasingly alarming as the pattern solidified. The most severe episodes consistently occurred following conversations or events that represented progress toward independence or challenges to my parents, control over my decisions and activities. The episode following my promotion announcement was followed by similar severe incidents after I mentioned considering apartment hunting with a colleague, after I declined to cancel social plans despite my parents' objections, and after I expressed interest in attending a professional development conference that would require overnight travel. Each of these episodes followed a consistent timeline. Within 30 to 60 minutes of the conversation or event that represented assertion of autonomy, I would begin experiencing nausea that rapidly escalated to severe digestive distress, accompanied by dizziness, confusion, and exhaustion that rendered me incapable of normal activities for hours or sometimes days. The correlation was so consistent that I began predicting when episodes would occur based on my interactions with my parents and my expressions of independence. When I successfully resisted their attempts to control my professional or personal decisions, I could anticipate that I would become ill within the following hour. This predictive accuracy forced me to confront the possibility that my illness was not related to stress in the way my parents had explained, but was instead connected to specific circumstances that involved challenging their authority or pursuing independent action. The timing was too precise to be explained by general stress or anxiety about professional and personal decisions. More concerning was the recognition that my parents' responses to my severe episodes followed patterns that seemed designed to reinforce my dependence on their support, while discouraging the independent actions that preceded each incident. They would provide nurturing care during my illness while subtly suggesting that the activities or decisions that had preceded the episode were responsible for my suffering. My mother would explain that my symptoms demonstrated the importance of managing stress through careful decision-making and avoiding situations that created unnecessary pressure or anxiety. She would recommend that I should reconsider the professional or personal commitments that had preceded my illness to prevent similar episodes in the future. My father would add observations about the connection between my health problems and my tendency to take on responsibilities or make decisions without adequate consideration of the physical and emotional costs. He would suggest that my recurring illness reflected the need for more careful self-assessment and more conservative approaches to career and personal development. These explanations created a psychological framework that attributed my suffering to my own poor judgment, while positioning my parents as protective guides whose advice could help me avoid future health problems. The implication was that following their guidance about professional and personal decisions would prevent the illness that resulted from my independent choices. The manipulative nature of this framework became apparent when I realized that my parents' recommendations consistently involved reducing my independence, limiting my professional advancement, and increasing my reliance on their financial support and decision-making guidance. Their suggestions for preventing future illness always involved choices that would enhance their control over my life. The journal documentation also revealed that my parents' knowledge about my symptoms was unusually detailed and accurate, even when I had not discussed the specifics of my condition with them. They would make observations about the progression and characteristics of my illness that demonstrated familiarity with the symptoms that exceeded what would be expected from casual observation. During one particularly severe episode in early December, my mother provided specific recommendations about managing nausea and digestive distress that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the symptoms I was experiencing. She would suggest remedies and treatments that were precisely targeted to the type of discomfort I was feeling, even when I had not described the details of my condition. My father would similarly demonstrate knowledge about the duration and intensity of my symptoms that seemed to exceed what I had communicated to him. He would make accurate predictions about how long episodes would last and what types of activities would be possible during my recovery periods. This detailed knowledge about my symptoms could have been explained by their attentive observation during my illness, but the specificity and accuracy of their information suggested familiarity that extended beyond casual monitoring of my condition during episodes. The most significant development in my growing awareness occurred when I began researching medical literature about the types of symptoms I was experiencing and the potential causes for the patterns I had documented. The professional research skills I had developed through my design work enabled me to conduct systematic investigation of medical databases and clinical studies related to digestive disorders, stress-related illness, and toxicology. The research revealed that the symptoms I was experiencing could be consistent with various forms of chemical poisoning, particularly substances that affected the gastrointestinal and nervous systems. The timing and progression of my episodes matched clinical descriptions of poisoning patterns more closely than they matched typical presentations of stress-related digestive disorders. The medical literature indicated that certain household chemicals and toxins could produce the specific combination of nausea, abdominal pain, dizziness, and confusion that characterized my severe episodes. More importantly, the research suggested that systematic exposure to small amounts of these substances could create cumulative effects that would intensify over time. This information forced me to consider possibilities that I had previously dismissed as impossible or absurd. The correlation between my symptoms and my assertions of independence, combined with my parents' detailed knowledge of my condition and their consistent discouragement of medical investigation created a pattern that could be consistent with deliberate poisoning. The consideration of deliberate harm by my own parents was so psychologically difficult that I initially rejected the possibility, despite the evidence I had documented. The idea that the people who had raised me and claimed to love me might be systematically poisoning me seemed incompatible with fundamental assumptions about family relationships and parental care. However, my professional training in analytical problem-solving provided a framework for evaluating evidence objectively, rather than allowing emotional responses to determine my conclusions. The patterns I had documented were clear and consistent, regardless of my emotional resistance to the implications. The decision to pursue independent medical evaluation represented the first major step toward breaking free from my parents' psychological control and trusting my own judgment about my health and safety. The growing evidence that my symptoms might be caused by external factors rather than stress gave me justification for seeking professional medical advice despite my parents' consistent discouragement. I scheduled an appointment with Dr. Patricia Wong, our family physician, without informing my parents about my intention to discuss the patterns I had documented and my concerns about potential environmental or chemical causes for my recurring illness. The decision to seek medical care independently represented a significant assertion of autonomy that I anticipated might trigger another severe episode. The appointment with Dr. Wong was scheduled for a Friday morning when my parents would be at their respective jobs and unable to monitor or interfere with my medical consultation. I prepared comprehensive documentation of my symptoms, including the journal entries that revealed the correlations between my illness and specific circumstances. Dr. Wong listened carefully to my description of the symptom patterns and reviewed the documentation I had prepared. Her response indicated genuine concern about the information I had provided, and recognition that the patterns I had identified warranted serious medical investigation. "Rebecca," she said after examining my journal entries, "the correlations you have documented are concerning and suggest that we need to conduct comprehensive testing to identify potential environmental or chemical causes for your symptoms. The patterns you describe are not typical of stress-related digestive disorders." Dr. Wong recommended extensive blood work and toxicology screening that would test for various chemical substances that could produce the symptoms I was experiencing. She explained that the testing would require specialized laboratory analysis that might take several days to complete, but could provide definitive information about potential poisoning or chemical exposure. The validation of my concerns by a medical professional represented a crucial turning point in my psychological recovery from months of manipulation and gaslighting. Dr. Wong's acknowledgement that my symptom patterns were abnormal and concerning confirmed that my analytical assessment was accurate, and that my parents' explanations were inadequate or incorrect. More importantly, Dr. Wong's recommendation for toxicology testing indicated that medical investigation of potential poisoning was reasonable and appropriate, rather than the unnecessary and counterproductive approach my parents had consistently characterized such testing to be. The blood work and initial testing were completed that same day, with results scheduled to be available within 48 hours for standard analyses and within 1 week for comprehensive toxicology screening. Dr. Wong explained that the testing would identify any chemical substances in my system and provide information about recent exposure to various toxins. The decision to pursue independent medical evaluation without my parents' knowledge or consent represented the most significant assertion of autonomy I had made since my health problems had begun. The action demonstrated trust in my own judgment and rejection of their authority to make medical decisions on my behalf. However, the psychological preparation for their response to my independent action was complicated by my anticipation that seeking medical care would likely trigger another severe episode based on the patterns I had documented. The irony that protecting my health might temporarily worsen my condition reflected the sophisticated nature of the control system my parents had established. The evening following my appointment with Dr. Wong, I experienced what would prove to be the penultimate episode in my parents' poisoning campaign. The symptoms began during dinner and followed the familiar pattern of rapid escalation to severe digestive distress and disorientation, but the intensity exceeded even my previous most serious episodes. The timing confirmed the correlation I had documented between independent action and symptom severity, but the intensity suggested that my parents' response to my assertion of autonomy was becoming more aggressive and potentially more dangerous. The episode lasted nearly 8 hours and left me concerned about my ability to survive future incidents of similar severity. However, the most significant aspect of this episode was my psychological response to the experience. Instead of feeling grateful for my parents' care and support during my illness, I maintained analytical awareness of their behavior and continued to document their responses for comparison with the patterns I had identified. This analytical distance during my suffering represented a crucial development in breaking free from the psychological manipulation that had made their abuse possible. My ability to maintain objective observation despite severe physical distress demonstrated the strength and clarity of thought that would enable my eventual escape from their control. The blood work results became available the following Monday morning. Dr. Wong called me at work to discuss the findings, which revealed the presence of ethylene glycol metabolites in my system at levels that confirmed recent and ongoing exposure to antifreeze compounds. The toxicology results provided definitive evidence that my symptoms were caused by chemical poisoning rather than stress-related illness. The medical confirmation of systematic poisoning represented the moment when my suspicions transformed into verified knowledge, and my psychological recovery from months of manipulation became complete. The evidence was clear, objective, and irrefutable, providing the foundation for understanding the true nature of my parents' behavior and taking decisive action to protect my life and future. The strength and analytical capability that had enabled me to recognize the patterns, document the evidence, and pursue independent medical evaluation despite months of psychological conditioning demonstrated that my parents' campaign of abuse had failed to destroy the core competencies that would enable my survival and transformation. The same skills that had made me successful in my professional career had protected me from becoming a victim of their murder attempt and would serve as the foundation for building an independent, authentic life free from their control. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.